Hey y'all, I'm Dan Hamilton, host of the Next Gen Warrior Show. As always, the Next Gen Warrior Show is brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush and the Texas Veterans Land Board. Today, my guest is Chris Lewis Cockrell, all the way from Virginia. He is a 9-year Navy veteran and host of the Kristof Lewis podcast. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing phenomenal. Thank you so much for having me on. I've really been looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So before we get too far into the conversation, can you tell us about your military service?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I was in the military, the Navy specifically, for 9 years. Essentially, the way I describe it is half that time was broken down into 2 different jobs, and they were both on the different side of the playing field. So the first portion of that was in Naval Special Warfare as a communicator. So if you peel that back a little bit, initially, I was an electronics technician, and that job can fill a lot of roles. So when I got a position in Naval Special Warfare, I was able to be a communicator, or an RTO, as they say, a radio telephone operator.
Yep.
And that obviously also, not obviously, but it also entails doing a lot of networking things as well. So you're doing a lot of different roles within that. Then the latter half of my career was a little bit different. I was working on a shore command, and I was in charge of communications on a lot of the Eastern Shore here in the Atlantic. And that was the first time that I was in a huge leadership role to me. And I had 45 sailors underneath me. So both had a lot of great learning lessons. And even though I didn't really look forward to some of those positions, they all taught me something very unique.
So I'm interested to know how your definition of success has changed since getting out of the military, because I've definitely sensed it since leaving the service, going to school, getting married, starting my job. It all kind of transitions as you leave the service. So I'm wondering, how has that focus of success changed for you?
Sure. And that's such a good question. And the relevancy is just, it's dead on, especially you said transition, right? So I feel as if the definition for me of success is just that. It's always transitioning. It's very dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And before I got out, I think this coincides with what you were saying, with a lot of other people think, is I thought it was this very tangible thing. I thought it was a goal that had to be obtained. It was perpetually something in the future that I had to attain and work forward. And what that was, by definition, was me never appreciating what I was doing in the moment.
Yeah.
So as that's evolved, and as I've evolved and how my job has evolved, I've been out for a year and a half now, I've come to the conclusion that it's more, and not to get into too much of a cliche, but I've come into the conclusion that it's more of the journey. And more specifically, it's how I'm living my life every day. It's, am I waking up and saying that I'm going to live the best life that I can and enjoy that day? And am I going to bed and saying, I did that. I accomplished what I set out to do. I was a little bit better than I was yesterday. And that's something that people throw around, and we see it a lot. But I try to live by that, and I don't mind living by cliches if it does make me a little bit better. So to answer your question more definitively, success has completely changed for me. It's gone from this tangible goal-setting accomplishment mindset to this dynamic, strategic, day-by-day, how am I living life? Now, I still have goals. I'm still very goal-oriented, but I've kind of molded it. You know, I've used the word dynamic a few times already, and that's really what it is. It's a conglomeration of both being able to have these achievable, obtainable stretch goals, but also being able to define and actually apply what I'm living on the day-to-day basis.
And I'm interested to know then, you have recorded, if I'm correct, over 100 podcasts with guests from all over. How has maybe the conversations that you've had with them, is there a central theme that you've learned from people across different industries about what has created success for them, either that is personally or professionally? And before you give your answer, you might be hearing the neighborhood dog downstairs, Annie. She likes to bark at the wind and anything else that's going on in the backyard out there. So if you hear her, she's our live audience here at the Next Gen Warrior Show. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I love that. And I think before I even get onto it, if I could start with what you ended with, I feel like we're living in a time where everybody's on Microsoft Teams, Zooms, Skype, and I've been on a lot of meetings, and it's just so acceptable. If like kids are yelling in the background or dogs are barking in the background, people are like, oh, whatever. There's a kid running across the screen. Like, it's totally fine. And it's so cool to see the evolution of just how meetings are conducted. So
professional life has become
totally
very personal. It's come into the bedroom and it's come into the living room in a way that no one expected.
Yeah, which is great. I love to see the change. But to answer your question, yeah. So what's today? We're recording this on a Tuesday. So yesterday, I just released, I think it was my 152nd guest. I've had 260 plus episodes total. But so yeah, I've spoken with 152 people. And through that, the answers have changed. And the answers have changed because I have changed. The thing is always, how do you get better answers? How do I make a better show? Become a better host? How do I become a better host? Become a better question asker to get better answers. So my evolution of the podcast, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately too, so it's funny that you bring it up, is the podcast has had this evolution because I've had this evolution. So it's almost a mirror of me. The questions changed for the last 2 years because I've changed over the last 2 years. I'll speak with people like yourself, and the answers that they give me help tweak my questions just a little bit. So it's like the telephone game. You fast forward 2 years and my questions are still in the same themes, and I'll answer what those are in a moment, but the strategic way that I answer the questions or the tweaks or the certain the words that I specifically use are there for a reason. So over all of these episodes and 2 years of podcasting, I've really honed down on just a few things. One of them is that I have felt through my military career and my now civilian career that I was always selling myself short. I was listening to friends, even family, the professional workforce of saying I could not obtain something personally. I'm a college dropout. I still don't have college, but I'm still able to do what I want. And I think there's other paths for other people. So if I could tangent real quick to answer your question even further, what I've noticed is that there's a million different ways to get that version of your success. And every single guest I've had has told their own unique version of that success, how they've obtained that.
Can I pause you real quick? Because one of the most interesting things that I like talking to people about is how, maybe the right word isn't stumbled into a career, but how you have changed, and your ability to adapt in different circumstances and change your version of success has gotten you to a place of where you are with the show and with the podcast. And you said that you've only been out for under 2 years. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Did anything that you did in your military career prepare you for having essentially a career in podcasting, or having the skills necessary to be able to host a show, to do the editing, to reach out to people, to brand it, to make the logos? I mean, you do everything on your show. How was it something did all of this come naturally to you, or have you had to, again, adapt and change after you got out of the military?
No, and that's a great question. And I hope my answer sparks that curiosity and initiative in some of the people that are listening. So to answer your question in short, and then I'll dive deeper into it, is no. I had no idea what the heck I was doing, but I got started. People tell me all the time, I want to start a podcast. I want to start a podcast. But most of those people, they don't start a podcast. And if they do, it doesn't run for more than 1, 2, 3 episodes. So the bottom line, and my initial response would be, you just need to start a podcast. And I didn't know anything. I didn't have any journalistic background. I didn't know how to speak. If you want a treat, you can go back and watch some of my first episodes. And frankly, you don't have to go back too far to be able to see that.
Do you feel like it's healthy for you to go back and watch those?
Yeah. So that's actually one other way I can answer your question in why I edit my own content, is because if you have a sports background, anybody listening, you can imagine a football player watches their game footage. Right. I really, really take it personally. It's like my Zen moments, my meditation moments, where I'm able to watch myself interview somebody, because I get to hear the cadence at which I talk. Am I talking too fast? Am I talking too slow? Am I boring people? Am I too excited? Am I rushing? All of these things. Am I hesitant? Am I nervous? All of these things. I'm able to watch my own game footage, and I'm able to get better as a result of it. Now, is it painful sometimes? Absolutely, it's painful to watch myself, but I'm able to listen to my guest all over again and much slower since I'm editing it. And then I also get to really pick apart how I'm delivering my questions and responses.
So were you always kind of, maybe in the back of your head, had this idea about having a show when you were in the service, or even prior to that? Can you go back to high school or something and like you think like, oh yeah, I always did kind of have this interest in broadcasting or communications, even though my military career might not have been specifically that. In some ways it was, right? If you were working in comms, but talk to us about if this has been a long-term interest for you, or if this is something that's been a new kind of thing that you've experienced.
Yeah, that's a cool question, because what it is essentially, I guess I could hone down on the theme of evolution of self. Is I am I'm consistently finding out who I am as a person, and I believe and I hope that I do that until the day I die, whenever that is. Now, I hope I know more tomorrow than I know today in some capacity, right? And that if I truly subscribe to a growth mindset, that will inevitably and perpetually happen. But to answer your question, I thought in high school, you mentioned high school, not really, but going back, I've always enjoyed a really good conversation. And of course, as people know, that when I interview guests, I call those the conversations because I like to keep them organic. But I didn't really see it within myself too much until probably hit my mid 20s, and I started really listening to podcasts and hearing the regular conversations, the Joe Rogans, the people like that, and they just have an intellectual conversation. And I was just infatuated with the consumption of the knowledge, and I was like addicted to it.
Yeah.
And that's why I fell in love with the whole conversational aspect of podcasting. And I started the podcast 5 months before I got out, but we don't have the whole entire day to go through why I started the podcast, but some of the reasons are because I felt as if in that leadership role within the military that I could do better. I had to be imaginative about it. I had to be creative about it, but I felt as if me in that leadership role, I wasn't delivering as much as I possibly could. So I wanted to go out of my job scope and interview people and be like, hey, you may not like your job right now, but first of all, you signed a contract, so you got to finish it. Second of all, when the contract is done, here are all these people that I've interviewed that some have military background, most of them do, some of them don't, but they're doing something they love, and they didn't listen to anybody telling them they can't do it, which is a little similar to my own story, right?
Yeah.
But they're also helping people along the way. So to further answer one of your other questions is, what are some of the pillars that the podcast stands on? Well, not only is it the transitional aspect of careers, whether it be military or civilian to civilian, but it's helping people. I don't interview people unless I can see that they're helping other people, that their content is geared towards helping other people.
The one thing that I think the veteran community struggles with that is actually very critical for the non-service member community to understand is the culture gap. And I think it's really essential for veterans, including you and I, to reach across the aisle, if you will, to talk about our military experience and to try to connect our military experience to non-service members. And one thing that I think often gets overlooked is that the transition of getting out of the military is such a key lesson to learn. If there was somebody at home in the audience who is not a service member, can you talk about what the military transition taught you about maybe their transition in career, how you could maybe make a one-for-one comparison that, hey, when I got out of the service, I did this, this, and this, and it might be totally different culturally from the experience that you're going through, but transition that we're experiencing now, being at home or transitioning a job or moving, those things that I learned after the military, I think are actually very applicable to non-service members in, across our country. So would you be able to maybe talk about your experience that you learned during your transition and how you would maybe apply it to a personal or professional career change for a non-service member?
Yeah, that's a really cool question, because, I mean, like I said, I have a lot of people that are military background, but a lot of people that aren't. And ultimately, I just want to help people. And we're always changing careers. I mean, I think the average person changes careers at least probably 7 times in their lifetime. And that's probably a conservative estimate. They're moving jobs, they're changing careers. And I think that some of them can be as drastic as going from the military to going to the civilian sector. One of the things that worked for me, and we were kind of talking about this off camera in a certain sense, is it's going to be different for everybody, right? So what works for me may not work for you or anybody listening, but what I recommend to your listeners is to take bits and pieces of the things that we're saying, take a little bit here, a little bit from there, ball it together and create your own version. Like we were talking about, a version of success, create your own version of what's going to work for you. And how can you accomplish that? Because, that's a little bit ambiguous. Well, I accomplish that by preparation. I started early. I remember specifically that in December of 2018, I started studying Linux because I knew I wanted to go in the IT world, and I was an ET and I didn't know anything about it. I wanted to work for Amazon as an engineer, which is nothing to do with being an electronics technician, but I studied Linux every single day for almost 2 years, a year and a half, and I got the job. So starting early, being prepared, being consistent, which has been unequivocally a success factor in my life, preparation, consistency, because if you start early enough, like I always recommend people getting out of the military, or if you're in a civilian job, you can just do it now too, because you don't have a deadline per se, a contract finish.
Expiration, yeah.
An expiration. You can just start now. And if you don't like what you're working towards, just shift gears, like it's okay to not finish what you started. And it's not always black and white, right? It's not always applicable that it's not a good thing to finish what you started. So it's okay to shift trajectory a little bit, do a little course corrections and find something you do like. But what you don't want to do is be getting out of the military in 2 months and start applying for jobs or whatever you're doing and figure out that that's not at all what I wanted to do. And then now you have even less time. But if you start earlier, then you have more time to course correct. And sometimes people live by, less time, I'm going to crunch, and that's the way I'm going to get my my success. But preparation, consistency, and not being able to change your course.
So how did you stay so consistent creating the content? Does it flow naturally for you?
Sometimes it does. I think that coincides with what's been coined as the flow state, just really getting into a flow state. And sometimes when I'm in that flow state, I just create content after content after content. I write down episodes, but essentially because
what are you doing when that happens? Your head just hit the pillow. Do you bounce back up and start writing everything down, or can you kind of walk us through the process of when it's happened before?
It's funny you say head hits the pillow, because a lot of my stuff does come at night when I'm laying down. I find it difficult to go to sleep because I'm doing things from 5:30 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night, sometimes later, between my day job, between podcasting and networking and doing all the things that we're discussing. So fortunately, we live in the world of cell phones. I have my cell phone here. Hey, I say, hey Siri, and I have her record something, or I write it down in my notes. I'll be during a gym workout. I'll be laying on my pillow, like you were saying, and I would literally just shoot straight out of bed and I'll write down a bunch of things. My wife's like, what the heck are you doing? It's 11 o'clock at night. And I was like, I have an idea. If I don't write it down right now, then I'm going to miss it. And I just write, I'm always, what time of day or night it is, I just write an idea down, and then I can come back to it later. I text myself that idea and I revisit it and I see how I can build upon it. That's how I come up with all the quotes that I do. They're organic, original quotes from myself that I'm just feeling in the moment. Maybe I'm in some deep contemplation in the gym or on a run, or I just have a revelation or an epiphany when I'm speaking with somebody like yourself in this kind of environment. And I just write everything down. And that's part of the reason I love podcasting, because I, quote unquote, write everything down. I say everything. It's as I've coined, my verbal journal. I get to say it out loud and I get to record it, and I can always revisit that, as I was kind of touching on earlier in a different question.
Hey, has talking out loud, has it helped you process in your military transition?
Yes. So as I said, I did it 5 months before I got out is when I started it. And it really did help me articulate myself better in my interviews. I was still in the infancy of my podcasting, but it did help.
But did it help you process what you were going through in the moment? Like now you have these thoughts, right? So you're getting out of the military. You're trying to apply for jobs. Yeah. You're maybe moving to a new place. You have a different house, a different home. And so I found I was writing a lot. I found that blogging, if I could almost write to a nondescript audience, it felt better. And I kind of wonder if for you, if blogging or if hosting the podcast was some sort of cathartic experience for you to help organize your thoughts and almost look at yourself from like a third person view.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think we were talking about goals earlier, right? I just think getting things out of your head is a good idea. Just that, plain and simple, whether it be writing and blogging, whether it be speaking and podcasting, whether it just be having a conversation with your spouse, a friend, anybody. I think getting out of your head is a completely different experience than keeping it in your head, because I think somehow you misinterpret what you really feel when they're just stewing around in your head as thoughts. And then when you see it written, or you hear your voice say it, And somebody's able to, especially conversations are so impactful because somebody's able to challenge you, not disagree, but just like be able to reply and then continue in that manner. So it's very powerful to get it out of your head. And through that, yeah, it most definitely helped me, especially because by that time I had done 5 months of asking people about career transitions and things like that and seeing what worked and didn't work.
Dude, so what would you be doing if you didn't have a podcast with all of these thoughts and with all the content that you're creating?
Great question. I'm not sure I would have actually. So I haven't, that's a phenomenal question. That's one of my favorite questions so far in general, not just in this podcast, because I have a lot of conversations, mind you. So I think that I wouldn't be having this surge of creativity or thoughts unless I initially did what I did and create a podcast. So essentially it's the tipping of the dominoes, which everybody's very familiar with. But not only can dominoes infinitely tip out of energy, but they can tip larger and larger and larger and larger dominoes. So what I'm getting at is that one simple idea of making a podcast, which I didn't even intend to do originally with my first episode, that one simple idea of recording a podcast in hopes of helping myself and other people flourished beyond imagination into 260 plus episodes to where now I'm having, I write down a thought or have a conversation with you and an idea or a question or an answer comes up that I've never heard before. And then it just like a branch, right? Mm-hmm. It starts with a trunk and then the branch comes off and then off the branch comes the smaller branches and so on and so forth. And you can't have all the limbs and the leaves and all the animals and things that live in it without having that strong trunk. And to me, that's kind of how I envision this spider web, this glass breaking of all these ideas. One idea leads to 2, leads to 4, leads to 8, leads to you name it.
Has the creativity internally helped your day job? Because for those, I don't know if they caught it earlier in the show, but you have a day job and you come home and you work on the podcast. So you're going through this creative process and then you're going to a day job. Has it impacted your day job and how?
So I work with customers now. I was an engineer, so I've been on both sides of the computer, if you will. So I was an engineer. I didn't really speak to people, but now I speak to customers and I have to be able to articulate myself and I need to have those thoughts in real time. Like you're asking me a question, I have to be able to grab hold on to every idea that you said and think about how I'm going to answer them while still listening to what you're saying in the present. And I want to be able to deliver on every single one of those points in a linear fashion to where it makes sense to the listener. So because I'm able to do that, because I practice so many times a week on the podcast, I've been able to do that with customers and internally. And you're right. Yeah. So I do work day job and then podcasting every night and 7 days a week. So it's busy, but it's not a bad busy. I think there can be a good and bad busy, and I really enjoy doing it. But to answer your question, yes, it's absolutely helped.
Someone that you really want to interview that you haven't been able to yet. If you could pick, like 3 leather chairs, a glass of scotch, and a conversation to have, who would be at that table for you?
Yeah, well, I'm actually yeah. So, well, if I can do past, I would love to be able to speak with General George S. Patton. He's somebody that I love reading about. But more recently, one of the people, and I don't know if this is more of like a expectant response, but I do really enjoy Joe Rogan. And he is what really, I mentioned it before, really got me into podcasting, very obsessive. And that's what helped propel me into the just wanting to be saturated in my hunger for wanting to like learn more about the universe, hearing some of those crazy topics, if you're familiar with it, and hearing some of those crazy topics. So I know he doesn't do interviews, but I would eventually love to be able to do that. And then actually, I am able to answer one of your questions, and I'm recording with him tomorrow night. And I never thought I'd get to record with him. He's most people don't know him. His name is Pejman Gadimi. He is an immigrant to the United States, and he wrote the book Third Circle Theory. Now, that book was, I would say, the number one book that set me in motion. So podcasting Joe Rogan and how to speak Joe Rogan. But the book is what set me into motion and realizing that I shouldn't sell myself short and that I should help other people. He breaks it down into the different circles, essentially how you know yourself and the level of helping other people. And I realized that I thought I was on a certain level of where my mindset was, and I was growing, but that I wasn't helping other people. So it led me to want to also create. That's why I said there's so many answers to why I created a
Yeah.
podcast. One of them is this gentleman, and it just reiterated and definitely drove home the point that I could be quote unquote successful, as we've discussed already. But what does that mean if I'm not helping other people achieve their own version of that as well? So I'm very humbled to be able to speak with him tomorrow. He's authored a few books, and he's been on a bunch of different great podcasts. And like I said, most people probably don't know about him, even though he has a pretty strong following on social media. But I'm very humbled to be able to speak with him tomorrow.
And I also want to talk about a podcast you just put out yesterday. I think it's part of your contemplation series called Pay Your Tuition. Yeah. And you talked a lot about the concept of failure. Could you give us just a quick recap on why the Pay Your Tuition and the failure that you experienced at school, and how that has actually essentially been a good thing for you? You use that as a positive.
Yeah. So in short, the lesson Pay Your Tuition was what we typically hear as it's either win or learn. It's never win or lose. It's only win or lose, or I should say it's only lose when you don't learn from it. So the way I was articulating it through the episode of Pay Your Tuition, it was more of you need to, I use the topic of finances. If you have a bad trade in the stock market and you lose X amount of money, to me, the way I've wired my brain is that's not money that I've lost. It's tuition that I've paid to learn not how to make that trade again. So that's more of a tangible concept for the people out there, but that is the concept that I used for everything in my life, whether it be not doing well within an episode or not doing well at work or just whatever failure it wants to be. If you're not able to learn from that and just really change your thinking into viewing that failure as you are paying whatever that failure is, the price of that failure, to learn not to do it again. And you only truly lose that money or that moment or whatever it is if you don't learn from it in that sense and view it like that. It's really just rewiring your brain.
That's a really great lesson to learn. And it's something that I've had to learn over time, because I tend to take failure very personally and kind of internalize it. And I've realized that it's almost the failure, if you can leave it where it was and almost act as like, hey, that's my pound of flesh for learning that lesson. I'm not gonna do it twice. Then you can actually go forward and be more successful because of that failure. But let me end with this real quick. We've had a great conversation. I've loved hearing your perspective on career, military transition. Is there something that we haven't hit on during this conversation today that you'd like to leave our audience with?
So we've hit on a lot of great topics, and I've really enjoyed the questions, and I think they're very good and what just needs to be talked about. One of the things I always end my contemplations with 100% of the time is that you can listen to all the best advice, the best podcasts, read all of the best books, because I've been on a reading kick for the last year, and you can do all of those things. You can have these conversations, but if you don't apply what we're talking about, it doesn't mean anything, truly. It's great shock value. It's great entertainment value. It might be fun. But what does it actually mean? Why are you listening to a podcast like yours or like mine? You know, like a growth-minded, just anything tailored around these topics, if you don't actually want to make something better for yourself. I always say at the end of them as well, my challenge to you is blah, blah, blah. It's typically to apply the lessons learned or the topics discussed in the episode. So the one thing I would say is, my challenge to you today from this episode is you don't have to agree with everything I say. You don't have to agree with everything Dan says, and fully expect you not to agree with everything you say. That would almost be kind of weird. I want you to be able to pick and choose and apply what works for you and fit it to your mold. But I do want you to take something from the conversation and apply it. And furthermore, I want you to apply it today, or at least think about it. And I would say one more thing separately is I always hope to encourage the conversation in other people. You know, you don't need a podcast to have these conversations. Maybe, hell, say it like with yourself. Write it down in a journal. Say it out loud. Record on your iPhone. You know, you can record and have a conversation with your spouse or your friend or brother, sister, mother, father. Take action, apply it, and have the conversation.
And where can the audience go to be able to follow you on social media and find your podcast?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. You can find me on Instagram. That's where I'm hyperactive with all the quotes you were talking about, and I post everything podcast there. My handle is Kristof Lewis, Kristof TOFLEWIS, or you can go to kristoflewis.com and find all things podcasting and learn a little bit more about me and the podcast.
Chris Lewis Cockrell coming in from Virginia and dropping some knowledge all over us. Kristof, I appreciate you being on the show today and having this great discussion. Keep up the good work. We really appreciate, having these conversations to help grow folks in the veterans and non-service members. As always, thank you for being our guest here on the show. Thank you for our audience, for everyone at home who has tuned into these conversations, even as we come in from the home studio and we have dogs barking outside. It's a different session every time we sit down for the conversations, but thank you for being a part of it at home. Thank you for being our guest. Continue to support veteran success by following shows like Kristof Lewis, as well as the Next Gen Warrior Show on behalf of Chairman George P. Bush of Texas Veterans Land Board. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior Podcast.